Chapter 5. Of course you can take her away with you. Cindy would love to see. I know exactly what you're trying to do, stepmother, and do you really think I'm going to agree to be his wife? Cindy cut Ida off in an ice-cold tone of voice. This time, her stepmother had truly crossed the line, and Cindy was done playing the well-respected lady. Her father's medals were sentimental, but this just made her feel as if she couldn't make a decision for herself, as if she was incapable of using her brain. Her stepmother had gone pale, but then she smiled at Londas, who seemed to be at a loss for words. Cindy's chest was rising and falling in rapid movements. She was near losing her temper, feeling her blood boiling deep within. She heard another giggle coming from the door behind her. Cindy realized her stepsisters were listening in on what was happening in the drawing room, most likely hanging on every word. All of a sudden, she felt sick to her stomach. Her palm was itching again. She needed to release her frustration on someone, but she knew it would only add oil to the fire. We both know you won't find anyone else, and the estate will be mine. With a flourish of her hand, Ida picked up her tea and took a sip, letting her gaze fall upon Cindy just over the rim of her cup. Ida was confident, too confident, and Cindy felt she could strangle her at any moment, or toss her tea in her face. This estate is never going to be yours. My father worked hard for it, and I won't marry a farmer just so you can take what rightfully belongs to me. I still have plenty of time, stepmother. Oh, and the ball. I'm going to attend. I'm certain I can find a suitable man there, Cindy said, with the sweetest voice she could muster, although deep inside she was ready to throw up. A moment of silence stretched for several minutes. Ida was shooting daggers at Cindy with her eyes. Londas was fiddling with his fingers. Cindy had finally said what was on her mind. She didn't care that she'd revealed her plans. She was going to the damn ball, whether Ida agreed or not, just so she could prove her wrong. Oh, you stupid child. You don't have an invitation for the ball. We should deal with this conversation privately. You are scaring our guest, Ida said, rising from her seat and touching her head. Cindy wasn't planning to move anywhere, and she didn't seem fazed by the fact her stepmother just told her that she didn't receive an invitation. She knew better. Whatever, stepmother. I'll be at that ball, whether you like it or not. And we're done with this conversation, Cindy snapped, still sitting on the sofa. I'm not marrying this clown. She turned to Londas. No offence, sir. She was doing her best not to storm out of the room, although her stepmother was really testing her patience. Londas made a strange sound, and his entire face had gone purple, most likely from embarrassment. Mr. Londas, let me walk you out. I truly must apologize for the behaviour of my stepdaughter, Ida said through gritted teeth, then gave Cindy a look that said she would deal with her later. Cindy just rolled her eyes again. She was too angry to come back with a snarky reply. She rose from her seat and left the drawing room as fast as she could. Her world was crashing down all around her, and knots of nausea were forming in the pit of her stomach. Perhaps she'd truly underestimated her stepmother. She nearly tripped over something when she walked back to the kitchen, but managed to stay on her feet. Then she heard that insufferable giggling again, and noticed that Teresa had stuck out her foot. It looks like Mummy is going to sell your ass to that fatty farmer. I bet you can't wait to suck him off, right? Susan snickered, and Cindy just smiled. Seconds later, she grabbed Susan by the neck and squeezed hard, bringing her closer to her face. Her other sister screamed, but Cindy was so done with their nonsense and nasty behaviour. Your mother is not getting her hands on my father's estate. I want you to remember that. And I'm not marrying a farmer just so she can void my father's will. Stay out of my way. Do you bloody understand me?" Her voice was just above a whisper, while her heart jackhammered inside her chest. She had never lifted a hand to Susan or Teresa, but at that moment she'd had enough. Susan's lip was quivering. Cindy was slowly choking her, unaware of her own physical strength. She finally let her go. Susan started taking long, deep breaths, grasping her throat, while Teresa was asking if she was all right. They were both staring at Cindy with fear in their eyes. Now she felt a bit guilty for losing control in such a manner. Her stepsisters weren't very intelligent, and they had no idea what that kind of incident could do to her probation. She only avoided prison because she'd come from a good home. Next time, she needed to be more careful. "Do the two of you understand what I just said?" she asked again, breathing in, trying to calm herself down. Both sisters nodded, not saying another word. She walked away, feeling worse than before. She might have stood up for herself, but now her stepmother was holding all the cards. Cindy knew Ida was already looking for anything to prevent her from attending that silly ball. The day of the ball was approaching quicker than she'd anticipated, and day after day Cindy had been coming back to her room completely exhausted. Ida was giving her more and more cleaning duties, and adding to that, training the new cook/maid was extremely draining. She had no time for anything else. Apparently, Susan had an upset stomach nearly a week ago, and Ida fired Elvira straight away after dinner. This was nothing more than her stepmother's revenge for the way Cindy had spoken to her in front of Mr. Launders. Now Ida knew what Cindy was planning, so she was desperately trying to jeopardize all her efforts. After her daily chores were finished, Cindy was too tired to even think about the dress, but she was forcing herself to paint. She was planning to buy a dress for the ball from a painting that she sold, but her next piece had to be spectacular. Cindy spoke to one of the buyers she knew at the market on Friday, and he seemed extremely interested in her work. She was thrilled. Cindy's stepmother hadn't said a word to her about Susan or Teresa, and she suspected that her stepsisters hadn't made mention of the incident in the kitchen. They were keeping their distance from her. Cindy knew they feared her now, and that meant they'd finally leave her alone. Although she may have felt a bit guilty for losing her temper, the end result had been exactly what she wanted. After meeting the buyer, she managed to finish her work early and then locked herself in her room. She began working on a new piece, the one that could bring her a decent enough coin to buy the most stunning dress. In the middle of the night, the day before the ball, the painting was complete. It was a portrait of her mother. Cindy used a lot of blue paint in the background. She had an old photograph of her, and she was inspired by it. Her colours were vibrant, and she loved the way the darker shades played and contrasted against the swath of magenta and various hues of violet. Her mother truly was a beautiful woman. This painting meant a lot to her. It was as if she was recreating the person she was becoming. After a few minutes, exhaustion weighed heavily on her, and she knelt down to rest for a bit. Every muscle in her body was aching. Before she'd gone upstairs, she had lifted, carried, cleaned, and mopped for hours, while her stepmother had continued to add a list of chores that needed to be done. She knew she had to be obedient, at least until she could find a way to gain her independence again. Cindy closed her eyes, and before she knew it, she was drifting off to sleep. The next day, she awoke to bright beams of the sun's rays as they streamed through her window. She jumped to her feet, having no idea why she was still wearing her clothes and not in her nightgown, and she was covered in paint. "No, no, I couldn't have fallen asleep," she whispered to herself, noticing that all her painting accessories were spread across the floor. She realized that last night, in her exhaustion, She must have fallen asleep kneeling over her bed. The ball was to begin in several hours, but now she had a painting she could sell. She needed to find the buyer, and soon. She had to purchase a dress for the ball. When she picked up her old pocket watch from her bedside table, she saw that it was nearly 11 in the morning. She was surprised that no one had barged into her room, telling her that she was already late with her duties. Cindy hurried downstairs and realized that her stepmother and stepsisters must have left early to pick up their dresses from the shop in town. Cindy had a lot of work to do today, but this was the perfect opportunity for her to sneak into town too, or perhaps even bring the buyer to the house. She didn't hesitate this time. Mr. Johnson was a respectable collector, and he'd always admired her work. When her father was still alive, he'd bought all of her paintings and encouraged her to continue with her talent, but after her father died, everything had fallen apart. Cindy couldn't find it in herself to care that the house wasn't cleaned, or that the cook was waiting for her in the kitchen. She was moving closer to her goal of removing the estate from the clutches of Ida, and she wasn't planning to waste any time this morning. Finding a suitable husband, someone other than Launders, was at the top of her list of priorities. She wasn't certain if her plan could work, but she had to at least try and make it to the ball. She hurried to town, and even managed to arrange a meeting with Mr. Johnson. She was a little disappointed when she only spoke to his assistant, but Laura was extremely organized. She assured Cindy that Mr. Johnson would see her in 3 hours. This wasn't ideal, but it would give Cindy just enough time after she sold the painting to run to town and buy the dress she'd asked the dressmaker to set aside for her. She honestly didn't care if she was going to be late to the ball. When she returned home, her stepmother and stepsisters were already there. They hadn't even noticed that she was gone, or that the house wasn't clean, which was a good thing. Ida seemed stressed about last-minute errands she needed to run, while Susan and Teresa were running around, panicking that they were going to arrive at the castle too late. Neither of her stepsisters had a man to accompany them to the ball. Cindy knew they were hoping the prince would notice them standing alone in the crowd of other women. She began cleaning to keep her mind off the fact that Mr. Johnson could arrive at any moment. She didn't want Ida to see him, so she stayed away from her attic room. Cindy knew Ida was keeping a watchful eye on her, and she didn't want her to jeopardize the sale. Besides, her stepmother had no idea Cindy would have enough money for a dress. She most likely assumed she wouldn't be attending the ball. The sun was slowly setting, and her stomach was tying itself in knots. In her haste to find a dress, she hadn't thought much about how she would get to the ball. She assumed that she could take the old carriage after her stepmother left. She had no intention of walking all the way to the castle. Cindy looked anxiously at the window in her stepmother's room, wondering if Mr. Johnson would like her painting. Ida finally caught up with her and asked her to tidy up the master bedroom, but her head was filled with memories of the past. She was suddenly inspired to create more art. She realized then how much she'd missed it. "Cindy, come here right away. I need you to curl my hair," Teresa called from the other room. Cindy wanted to avoid any and all arguments, so she went to help her. She knew she could sneak away from the house after Ida and the girls left. Her plan was coming together nicely. "Oh, I really hope the prince isn't as spoiled as they say, and actually dances with us. There will be other ladies there, but after all, we do come from a good family," Teresa was saying to Cindy, wearing a garish bright pink dress and powdering her cheeks. Cindy was curling her hair, nodding along as Teresa spoke, but her mind was on the painting. "He might choose me," Susan stated, rolling her eyes at her sister's words while brushing her hair. They began to argue over who was better looking. Soon, just as Cindy predicted, their argument turned into a cat fight. The girls were shouting at each other, while Cindy wondered if she had shoes that would be a good match for the dark blue dress she'd chosen from the shop in town. "Ladies, we're leaving in 5 minutes," Ida said, walking into the room all of a sudden. Her eyes automatically moved to meet Cindy's gaze, and then she heard a carriage arriving. It was undoubtedly Mr. Johnson. "Cindy, I believe you wanted to attend the ball," Ida continued, "but I knew you didn't have a proper dress, so I left something in your room. You've truly been working hard over the past few days, and I wanted to reward you." Cindy looked at her stepmother like she'd grown a pair of horns. She couldn't believe Ida would notice her hard work. Then she heard the horses and remembered Mr. Johnson. She gave her stepmother a weak smile and then excused herself, thinking that luck was finally on her side. She was going to the ball, and she was going to be an artist again. "Things are looking up for me," she thought.